Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And welcome to this virtual offering of our traditional Francis Scott Key lecture series, FSK from Home. This program is the last program in the 2020 FSK from Home series. We will return to the FSK from Home series in March 2021. I am Margot Copera, the museum's public programs manager.
And I'm Hillary Chang, the Director of Individual Giving at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We are so excited you're able to join this FSK from your home or wherever you may be today. Our Francis Scott Key, or FSK, lecture series is one of our favorite series here at MCHC. Typically, these lectures are ticketed events. They're held in person in our auditorium, and all lectures are followed by light refreshments and socializing. Since we are not able to have lectures in person now, we reformatted the series to be this virtual public program, the FSK from Home. We also created the FSK from Home Giving Challenge. With this challenge, our goal is to raise $5,000 in order to cover our public program expenses for 2020. Normally, these expenses would have been covered through our ticket sales, but as we all know, nothing about 2020 has been very normal so far. We hope you will consider making a donation to our FSK from Home Giving Challenge through the donate button on the bottom of your screen. Money raised will help support the creation of programs just like this one. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the program. And with that, I'll let Martina take it away.
Thank you so very much, Hillary. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this FSK lecture. Like Margot said, it is the last of the season, and it is an absolute treat. It has been rescheduled a couple of times. My name is Martina Kado. I work at the MCHC as Director of Publications, and it's my pleasure to talk to our very own friend, Jean Baker, about Latrobe today. So, hi, Jean, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for persisting.
Absolutely. So we've worked really hard to make this happen. Before we get started, let me just say a few words about Jean. Dr. Jean Harvey Baker is Professor Emerita at Goucher College, where she was Bennett Harwood Professor of History. She holds a bachelor's degree from Goucher College and a master's degree and a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. And when we prepared for this talk, Jean told me that a great part of her career as a researcher is due to the fact that she taught at a liberal arts school such as Goucher College, which enabled her to pursue a vast array of interests. And if you look at the stunning number of books and articles that she's published over the years, you can see subjects as diverse as the Civil War, presidents and political parties in various periods of American history, including but not limited to Maryland, and women's history, from suffragists to reproductive justice in all their contradictions and controversies. So some of her titles include Affairs of Party, the Political Culture of Northern Democrats in Mid-Century America, for which she won the Berkshire History Prize, Civil War and Reconstruction, Votes for Women, the Suffrage Battle Revisited. Also, and that's something that's relevant to our talk today, Jean is no stranger to the biography as a historiographical genre. So she has written books on Mary Todd Lincoln, for which she also won the Willie Lee Rose Prize in Southern History, The Stevensons of Illinois, the biography of an American family, James Buchanan, Margaret Sanger, and finally, Building America, the Life of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, published this year by the Oxford University Press. Finally, as a biographical introduction, full disclosure, Jean has been a long-standing friend of this institution. Many of our current and former staff members have either been her students or have worked with her on this research project and think very fondly of her. And we also have had the pleasure and the honor of having her serve as a member of our publications committee. So welcome again, Jean.
Thank you very much.
Before we start, let me just give a few pointers to those who may have not joined us in our public programs before, virtual public programs before. So there is a chat function, which many of you have already figured out, to the right of your screen, where you can send us comments, where you can tell us where you're from and what you're thinking about the lecture. This is also where we will be publishing links to various things that we will be referring to during the talk. So one of them is definitely going to be the link to our museum store, where you can buy Jean's book. If you haven't already read it, this is a really good opportunity to buy it either for yourself or one of those history lovers among your circle of family and friends. It is well worth the read. Also, we will leave some time at the end for questions and answers, because this is your chance to ask Jean about this book and about this project. So to the bottom right hand of your screen, there is a little button that says Ask a Question. Feel free to use it throughout the talk. And at the end, we will read some of your most interesting questions and hope that Jean has some answers. All right. If we're ready to get started, Jean, I was hoping that we could begin by you telling us a little bit about your research and writing process for this book. Did you have a moment where you realized that, you know what, I think this is going to be another book? And how long did this process take you? Because this book looks really neat. It's 250 pages. It reads fantastically well. But how vast is this project from the get-go, from the first notes you take to actually having the book in hand come in from the publisher?
Martina, I think there are two kinds of projects that I've been involved with in my life. And the first of those in which there are not enough sources. I can remember doing the book on Mary Todd Lincoln, and somebody in Illinois thought they had a Mary Lincoln letter. We would spend hours looking at it, looking at even the penmanship. Now, with Latrobe, there is just a fantastic amount of stuff. There are 9,000 letters of Benjamin Latrobe. He used, by the way, a polygraph, which is a sort of awkward machine with two pens. And so he made transcripts of all his letters, and we have those. We have his journals. We have his watercolors. And I must now give a shout out to what I used to call the Maryland Historical Society, but guess what? I'm moving along to this MCHC business. The Maryland Center for History and Culture has the bulk of the Latrobe material, and they have been good custodians of it. And there are also Latrobe's buildings. So in terms of trying to find a project, this was certainly one that I knew that there would be enough material to eventually spew out a book.
Thank you for that. And this is a timely talk, not only because your book came out, but because actually in September this year, we marked 200 years since his passing. So maybe you could tell us how you zeroed in on Latrobe after all these subjects, Mary Todd Lincoln and suffragists and others. Why Latrobe, and why particularly a biography as a genre, as this narrative account of somebody's life that involves both the private and the professional or the public aspects of their life and work? Why do you think that was fitting for this project?
Mm-hmm. Latrobe, in terms of previous books that I've written, is unusual, but I wasn't getting any younger. Perhaps others of you are able to do that. And these trips that I used to take to research repositories were sort of repugnant to me. I wanted to stay at home. I also wanted to stay at home because I wanted to do a Baltimore project. And Latrobe, although ironically he didn't live very long in Baltimore, he certainly shaped our cityscape. And so I turned to Latrobe, and I think it's true that teaching in an undergraduate college makes you more receptive to other kinds of projects. University professors often get pigeonholed into categories where they only write about those things in that pigeonhole. And teaching at Goucher, I was able to extend my interests, and Latrobe seemed to me to be a way in which I could expand myself as I grew older, and it has worked out. This man is a really amazing human being. I wanted to write a biography because other aspects of Latrobe's career have actually been covered. And his architecture, for example, there was a huge book, perhaps 700 pages on his domestic architecture alone. But I wanted to investigate the man because even with a cursory beginning, I understood what a really interesting kind of life that he lived. And therefore, I wanted to do a from birth to death investigation of his life. You know, biographers, when they begin, they're always looking for the pattern in the rug, some sort of key to the person's personality. I'm reminded of Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale used to take her dolls apart just so she could sew them up again, which certainly is an introduction to her later nursing career. Mary Todd Lincoln used to insist with her father that she go to political meetings with him. And so as I began this biography, Martina, I was always looking for how I could center the focus of the book. And it took me a very long time to find that center.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I just like to add something here. I know you wrote an article some years ago that talked about biography as a social history. So my personal commentary would be that is also a great contribution of this book, because even though it follows Latrobe's life from birth to death, it definitely provides a social historical aspect of the United States during this time. And I think that adds value to this book. Why don't we get started on Latrobe himself? Your biography opens with his early childhood and his Moravian background. So could we say a few words about what it meant to be a Moravian, what it meant to grow up as a Moravian? What is this denomination, and what were their views on upbringing, and how did that shape Latrobe, both as a child and afterward as a young man and an adult?
Benjamin Henry Latrobe grew up in Fulneck in England, and I think we have a slide up showing.
We are seeing the slide, yes.
The exact place. It still exists. It's still a school. When Benjamin Henry Latrobe was born in 1764, his parents were luminaries in the Moravian denomination of Protestantism. They believed that it was best if their children were raised in a communal setting without parents. This was the way that you reached Jesus. And this is a very Jesus-centric kind of approach to religion. You must, in fact, envelop the idea of spirituality and meeting with Jesus. And if your parents were with you all the time, that would, to some extent, contaminate this process. And so Benjamin Henry Latrobe, after he was weaned, he was put in a boys' dormitory in Fulneck, and older Moravians were his surrogate parents. And then he moved into an older dormitory. When he was 12, he was chosen, because he was an excellent student, to go to the pedagogium that the Moravians had developed in what is now Eastern Germany or Western Poland. And so he went off to two of these schools. Benjamin Latrobe was a terrific student. He was never deficient in his studies, but he was deficient in his embrace of the Moravian a religion. And so despite the standing of his parents, he was soon expelled from these schools, which was really quite a blow to both his parents, who were active, as well as his brother, Christian Ignatius, who became a minister. And at this point in his life, he moved to London.
Correct. So having been expelled, having moved to London, he moves back in with his parents, if I remember correctly. What does his life look like? And what does that do to him, first of all, in terms of his perception of family relations? But also London is where Benjamin Henry Latrobe first starts to apprentice for the many professionals that, let's say, engaged in matters of architecture, because we are talking about a period of time when architecture was not yet a profession the way it is today. It is one of those degrees today, such as medicine or law, that you cannot practice without a specific degree and even without a specific license for that. This was not the case in his time. So you would have had carpenters, builders, mechanics, all kinds of professionals coming in from all sorts of entries into building. So what kind of early aesthetic or early experience of architecture did Latrobe have during these years in London?
London was simply an entire new life for Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He arrived in 1783 and he lived there for 13 years. And it really became the focal point of his later career. When he was kicked out of expelled, I guess I should say, from the Moravian schools, I thought that I could focus on Benjamin Henry Latrobe as a rebel. But
right.
This von Breda portrait, and this is no rebel. This is a young man who came to London, who had his horizons expanded, and who chose to be an architect. London created his architecture. He was an apprentice in one of the better known architectural schools, and he learned a neoclassical approach to architecture. In fact, I want to say one word about the von Breda portrait, which you all are looking at. I spent too much time trying to figure out his hair. It wasn't one of those wigs that we expect. And was that a wig that young men wore? No. Eventually, I've decided that this was the kind of hairstyle that young men in London wore. And it's fairly conventional. So this idea of mine that this guy was going to be a rebel was blown to bits. Benjamin Henry Latrobe did get some independent commissions while he was a young man in London. And the next slide shows an early residence. This is Ashtown. It's in Southeast England. It's still there. And it shows some of the really interesting aspects of his aesthetic. First of all, it's durable, it's stone, it's permanent. Secondly, while it is simple, it nonetheless has a certain elegance about it. We see the portico with the columns as an early expression of his classicism. We see the different windows on each level that make the house an interesting kind of residence. And so even when he was in England, Benjamin Henry Latrobe was showing signs of his brilliance. Also, when he was living in London, his personal life was expanded. He married, he had 2 children, but sadly in 1793, his wife and a third child died. It was at that point that Benjamin Henry Latrobe made the decision, which all Americans have benefited from, to move to the United States.
Thank you, Jean. And I definitely think that we will be seeing signs of the Ashdown House, more elements as he moves on to the States. And a phrase that is repeated very often throughout your book to describe his aesthetic is refined simplicity, or simple elegance, where he considered buildings to be self-standing sculptures and thought that they should be enough in their simplified grandiosity, that there was no extra adornment necessary. So already in London, we see where he's going with his projects.
Yeah,
at the same time.
That's exactly right. Yes.
And so at the same time, he suffers this very tragic personal blow, and decides to emigrate to the United States. What we should mention is that why he chose the United States. That happens to be because he had some connections on his mother's side, correct?
Yes, yes. Here we have a slide of that really shows some of Latrobe's interest in watercolors. He was a fairly excellent watercolorist, but
Yes, he was.
Of this migration from England to the United States, it took 2 weeks to get out of the English Channel. A trip that usually took 2 months took 4 months. But finally, in the spring of 1796, Benjamin Henry Latrobe arrived in the United States and began this new life. Within months, he was having dinner with George Washington. He was spending the night at Mount Vernon, although he had not very good things to say about the architecture of Mount Vernon, which he thought no better than an English clerk would live in. But nonetheless, here is Benjamin Henry Latrobe in what I thought of as a new possibility to understand his life and to pattern my book around. And that was that he would be a patriotic new American.
Right. So if I could just pause for a second to talk about his perception of the United States. And so he considered himself to be a fourth generation American on his mother's side, actually. She had been born in Pennsylvania and had some family and land there. So I think it's really remarkable that he sees this idea of the American identity as a form of return, because maybe in this period of time we perceive the United States as a country that people flock to, but instead there's this transatlantic exchange going on. There had been generations of people living in Britain and living in the States and going back and forth. And also he had a propensity to mythologize his origins and his identity. So by saying a fourth generation American, it kind of makes me wonder whether was there a perception of the American identity even before 1776? Or would this have been something that Latrobe used, just like he used his Bonneval name to mythologize his connections to French royalty? Any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you know, the interesting thing about Latrobe's view of himself as an American is that he would always have quite mixed feelings about the United States. When he came to Virginia, he joined the militia. He wrote a long treatise on Pocahontas and John Rolfe. He was a Mason who went to meetings and met other men when he was living in Virginia who were patriotic Americans. But always behind Latrobe's embrace of this new land was a skepticism. He was a snob, and he was never really comfortable with the kinds of social arrangements that Americans had adopted. He was horrified once when he went out to dinner and found that the butcher that he went to was also at the party. And so there is an ambivalence about his feeling, even though he called himself a fourth generation American. What we have on the screen now is a real gem of Benjamin Latrobe's architectural work. It's the Bank of Pennsylvania. He had moved from Norfolk to Richmond, and now this, by the way, this is a really peripatetic guy, and he's
Yes, he is.
come to Pennsylvania and created this bank, which I use as a slide because it shows all the neoclassical vocabulary that we talk about: the portico, columns, the capitol, the mass that Martina spoke about, the windows, Palladian windows, and the low saucer dome, which will be a significant aspect of all of his buildings. Note in the slide that the other buildings look quite inferior to this splendid bank, and they are brick. Latrobe built for permanence, and these are the kinds of buildings that he expected would inspire Americans. And indeed, certainly this Bank of Pennsylvania is a gem. However, in the next slide, we see what happened to it. This is in the 1870s. It gives you some sense of the scale of the bank. Right. But the decision was made by the eminent authorities in the municipality of Philadelphia to take down the bank. And here is the process of doing so. This is a portrait of the most famous of the PEALE portraits of Latrobe. It's in the White House in their collection. It shows him as he was in his early days in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, he also was able to find a loving wife, and Mary Hazelhurst, who married Latrobe in 1800 when he arrived after he had been in Philadelphia for a while, turned out to be a superb partner for him throughout his life.
She definitely did. I'm glad you brought it up because part of his family life, let's put it that way, is he was a very affectionate father and husband. He did leave two of his first children back in England while he got his affairs in order after moving to the States. And after that, he brought them over to the States. And his second wife, Mary, actually took to them, you say in the book, as if she were their own mother. So they had a really, really loving and affectionate relationship and family life, which Latrobe attributed to his early Moravian childhood as being away from his parents and being raised in a more communal atmosphere. So he really relished this family atmosphere and his children. One of your chapters is actually called the Beloved Mary and the Little Folks. So he really enjoyed that family life. I also can't help but recall the London chapter or the London days again, because as you mentioned, pretty soon after his arrival in the States, Latrobe ends up rubbing elbows with no less than 3 United States presidents. And back in London, his father had known Johann Christian Bach, Joseph Haydn, Friedrich Handel. So there seems to be kind of a family a propensity towards just being mercurial and being social. So I think we can now move to maybe his most important projects in the States. So we saw the Ashton House. Did you want to comment on this first?
Yes, one comment before we get on to his.
So this goes back to his perception of America and being a kind of a misfit.
This goes back to his criticism of the United States. This is called, and this is classic Latrobe satirist, overseer doing his duty. And there you have the overseer and the enslaved women who are working. This is a watercolor that is often used in textbook accounts of slavery in Virginia, and it speaks to, again, the reservations that Latrobe had about his new country. However, in 1803, he needed a job and asked Thomas Jefferson, who he knew in Philadelphia and who in 1800 had become president of the United States, for a job, and got one as the superintendent of public buildings in Washington. And here we see Latrobe's vision of the Capitol. It is classically plays up on Greek and Roman architectural traditions. He and Jefferson often argued about details of the US Capitol, and Jefferson won some of those fights, and then Latrobe would complain and say, Jefferson thinks he knows more about architecture than I do, which was certainly not the case. But here we begin to see what came to me as a biographer as a central theme of Latrobe's life. He was a builder. He would build the United States, and along with his work on the Capitol and to a lesser extent on the president's houses, as we called it then, Latrobe was responsible for all kinds of physical improvements. He worked on canals. He surveyed roads. His idea was that if the United States, this great experiment, was going to live up to its expectations, it certainly needed to pay attention to arts, to culture, to transportation, and to commerce. And he was active in all of those fields.
Exactly, and I'm glad you brought us to the U.S. Capitol, because I was going to ask you more about that in the President's House. There's a whole chapter devoted to capital projects in your book, so it means projects in the capital city, but it also means his capital projects. So the White House and the U.S. Capitol are probably two of the most iconic buildings of the United States, not just in the minds of Americans, but also citizens of other countries as they perceive the United States. But also in your book, you refer to his work on the U.S. Capitol, and which was twofold, by the way. So he was hired by President Jefferson, and he was also hired by President Madison after it was burned down in the War of 1812 by the British. You call it his albatross and his legacy. So I think it's really important to mention it, not just because it's such an iconic building, but because it almost epitomizes his relationship with America. You mentioned the troubles he had with President Jefferson in terms of ideas. I think we see the lanterns there where President Jefferson won, and Latrobe would have preferred the lanterns. So the skylights, from the fact that he wasn't the only architect working on this, and we know he didn't like to play well with others. His idea of genius was that it was a solitary, monopolistic endeavor. To his attitudes to public spending and how his ideas always seemed a little too extravagant for the Congress to approve. Maybe you can tell us a little more about that?
Okay, well, you're looking at one example of his, what might call extravagance, and certainly the Congress. This is the House of Representatives. It's a digitized a reproductive image of the assembly room that he made for the south wing of the Capitol, which is where the House of Representatives sit. Now, this is an incredible building for this young republic, and there were lots of congressmen who, after all, controlled the purse and Latrobe's salary, who felt that a republic such as the United States was attempting to create should never have these kinds of extravaganzas. There were other problems, though, with a room like this. John Randolph, who was a crusty old congressman from Virginia, complained that he couldn't hear. And when Congress was sitting during the winter, it was too cold. Latrobe always responded to congressmen by insulting them. He called congressmen clowns and said that they were only interested in their own reelection. But in any case, he created this vast and truly superb place for them to have their proceedings. And when they complained that they couldn't hear each other's speeches, Latrobe said the speeches weren't very good anyway. The problem here, if we can go to the, is that after Latrobe was essentially fired by Congress, and his version of the Capitol, which, by the way, did not have the rotunda, was completed, he had nowhere to go. He had run out of commissions in Washington. And so he went off to Pittsburgh to build a steam engine as an agent of Robert Fuller. And this ended in somewhat of a disaster. But he was called back to finish this important Capitol. And here we see the Capitol in ruins. And Latrobe was able to improve the building. And in a way, this is one of his great legacies. As Martina, as you say, the Capitol was a multi-authored building. And I believe vigorously that he would hate it of the dome that is on it now. But nonetheless, he came back, finished this Capitol, and then ended up in our own Baltimore.
Exactly. And by the way, I love these portraits, how we can follow him not only as he changes as a man, but the fact that his staple eyeglasses are always there on the top of his head,
Yes.
or on the desk in front of him in the von Breda portrait. I find them fascinating. So thank you for including them in your presentation here.
Good. Yeah. All right. Well, we will now. After he was fired a second time by Congress, he moved to Baltimore. This is the wonderful digitized map of Baltimore in 1814, and Latrobe is responsible for the two great structures that we appreciate as Baltimoreans. First of all, the cathedral, which is somewhere in there, and as a perspective. I put this cross section of the Basilica in the slide. Mm-hmm. I think that we know that the way that the Basilica looks from the outside, but this is an example of what Latrobe was trying to do in America, and that is to create a profession of architecture. And his elegant drawings were one effort to explain to carpenters and mechanics and whatever that there was something beyond their copybooks. And this cross-section of the Basilica suggests the great perfection of what is a splendid building and still is.
If I could just interrupt you for a second, I believe that there is a great virtual tour of the Basilica from the inside on the Basilica website. I believe it's America's First Cathedral.org. I'm not sure, maybe our staff can look it up and post it, but it's definitely easily findable. And I was exploring it yesterday. It is very detailed, and you can definitely see the light and his elements, his architectural elements that he included in there. So it's worth a look.
Yeah, and finally, because I think our time is running on, this is Latrobe's Baltimore Merchants Exchange. It too is a colossal, monumental building.
Absolutely.
Effort to get lots of mercantile shops and whatever into one space, and there's a customs house in there, there's a U.S. bank, etc. And Latrobe was very, very happy because you could walk up around the rotunda and look out into the harbor, and if you were a merchant, you could see when your ships were coming in. These two buildings are Latrobe's great contribution to Baltimore, but after this, he moved to New Orleans, and to finish his biographical profile, he undertook efforts to make a municipal water system. And while he was there trying to finish this project that he thought would give him an annuity for the rest of his life, he suffered an episode of yellow fever and died in September of 1820.
And that brings us to that unfortunate connection that we have with Latrobe in the present day. I'm certain that when you were working on this book and when we were planning this talk, even last year, we had no idea that we would have a pandemic experience of our own to parallel that of Latrobe. The yellow fever is mentioned in your book a number of times. This is just for our readers and participants here, almost to the point where once I got to Philadelphia and you mentioned how the yellow fever was almost a yearly occurrence in that city, I thought that it was a foreshadowing. I did not know how Latrobe died before I read the book. So it's definitely there. And not only did he succumb to it, he had a brother-in-law die of it, and actually his son, who he was training to be an architect as well, also passed of yellow fever. So it was definitely a presence in many American cities, almost on a yearly basis, like you said. But also what I gather from that, and this is where I want to pull it back to both the biography, the private and the professional for Latrobe, is Latrobe's belief in investing in public works. So it would have been called internal improvement back then, but today we call it infrastructure. He believed that there was a sort of public good in investing in waterworks, investing in bridges and roads. And there was a tension between Congress funding and commercial interests as well. So he brought that ideal along with him. And also, since we have the merchant exchange here, just as a final note, that building is no longer there. It was demolished around 1900, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So I studied your work. So it's really interesting how the two Baltimore projects, which brought this talk to Maryland and our core audience, were actually so on the opposite sides of the spectrum. One was devoted to spiritual matters because Bishop John Carroll wanted a big house for Catholic worshipers, and the other was devoted to commercial matters. But Latrobe brought them both together in his architectural aesthetic by making them both temples of matters spiritual and commercial, leaving a great legacy of that. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And my final question to wrap up this official, so to speak, part of this talk would be to go back to his notion of family. Maybe if you have a few last words about his family life. And I ask that not only because of his private life, but because of his professional life, he referred to buildings as his professional children. And you mentioned a few times in your book that there was this idea of buildings giving Latrobe stability that maybe he didn't feel he had in his early life or growing up. So he seems to have always looked for that, stable anchoring factor, even if he was a nomad all of his life. So I thought it was remarkable how these two things merge in Latrobe.
Mm-hmm. It's true. It's true. His personal life was to me very, very, very modern. He and
Right.
his wife Mary were the most permissive of parents, and he was the most loving of husbands. But in terms of the home as a sanctuary, we never think of the home as a sanctuary in this particular period. But Latrobe was well ahead of his times, in part, I believe, because he never forgave his own parents for subjecting him to this Moravian communal living that he really despised.
Thank you, Jean. I could talk about this for hours on end because it's a fascinating book. And once again, there is a link in our chat for our audience to purchase the book if they want. I will now encourage our audience to post more questions. I see that we have received some in our questions and answers a little rubric. So to the bottom right hand of your screen, there is an Ask a Question button. If you want to ask something, this is your great chance to talk to Jean. And while we wait for those questions, I will invite Hilary Chang, our Director of Individual Giving, to come back and speak to us about our challenge. Hi, Hilary.
Hi, Martina. Thank you for the introduction. And that was such a great and interesting conversation. It was a pleasure to listen to. So I just wanted to give everyone a quick update on our FSK from Home Giving Challenge. I'm so excited to share with everyone that we have raised, drum roll, over $8,000 and exceeded our goal of $5,000. That is so incredible. Thank you so much to everyone who has contributed and helped us exceed our goal. As I said before, money raised above and beyond our goal will go towards our public programs for this year and also for next year. Thank you for helping us weather 2020 and lay a foundation for next year. If you have not already, there's still time to make a contribution through the donate button on the bottom of your screen. You make all of our work possible. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it back to Martina so we can answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Hilary. And thank you to all of our audience and everybody who donated today. That goal was definitely exceeded, and we truly, truly appreciate your kind gifts because they enable us to keep providing these programs for free. All right, so if Jean is ready, I think we can ask some more questions. There is one that says, from Sue Morris, you describe Latrobe as living a peripatetic lifestyle, which is certainly how we here in Pittsburgh appreciate him. Having dipped into this city, worked on some steamboats, and allegedly designed some homes, then left. Do you feel that his personality got him in trouble and kept him on his move? I'm thinking about that elitism and perhaps even his genius for design and self-confidence that left him with so few real peers. It's a complex question.
Yes, I'm not sure I got all of that. I did hear the word genius in getting in trouble. Latrobe spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it was that gave him this ability to design buildings, to be a successful engineer. And he came to believe in what we call the nature versus nurture, that it was nature and that his ability to be a brilliant architect and a successful engineer was inherited from, get this, his maternal aunties. Aunties was the last name of mother. But nonetheless, this gave him a kind of braggadocio that he had that many Americans despise. So he was constantly getting in trouble with authorities everywhere. And this, of course, goes back to the early life as a rebel in Moravian schools. But he was always contesting. He was always arguing. And he always was convinced that in the way of geniuses, that he was right. He probably was right, for example, when he argued with Thomas Jefferson whether to have lanterns in the domes of the House of Representatives. He probably was right when he was working on his steamboat, which, by the way, he called the Buffalo.
Yes, he did.
An indication of his American side. But he was right about aspects of how you would navigate, how you would put a steam engine on a boat. But this gave him a certain arrogance that guess what? Those Philistine Yankees didn't like. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Well, I think the book answers that question, actually. It's a really complex question, and all of these facets are featured in your book. There is another twofold question, or it's two questions from the same participant. And I think it's important for us to go back to, for example, his watercolor, The Overseer and His Duty, because it's also important. We would be amiss if we didn't say that Latrobe actually did own slaves. So this question asks, how did you find the names of enslaved people in the book? And do you have any more information about David Smith and Francis, no last name, the enslaved people whom he owned? I believe David was given or sold to his son, John H.B. Latrobe. This is what the question says.
To answer, I looked hard to find out, and obviously the questioner knows a lot about Latrobe, because David Smith was one of his either enslaved or indentured servants. We think in binary terms, I think, of enslaved and free, granted limited freedom. But it seems to me that David Smith, who was Benjamin Latrobe's helper of all things, but mainly took care of the horses and carriages when Latrobe could afford them, was somewhere in between. And he did sell David Smith's indenture to someone when he needed money. And whether this is slavery or not, well, it nonetheless is not freedom. And while Latrobe spoke early in his life against slavery, and he promised that he would write a long treatise about it, he never did. And I think he was one of those people who was compromised. They opposed the idea of slavery. Someone with Latrobe's liberal instincts surely would. But on the other hand, in the United States, he didn't see any way to abolish slavery. And so he was caught in this intellectual conundrum, which translated into keeping servants that were hardly free servants.
And one follow-up question. We started a few minutes late, so I think we can afford to maybe stay online a few minutes longer. Just a second. Was slave labor used to build a cathedral? I'm assuming this person means the Baltimore Basilica. I know it was used for the U.S. Capitol, and Latrobe was actually criticized for not honoring those workers. What about the Basilica?
Is this a question about using the enslaved to build?
Yes.
It's always seemed, it's the utter irony that the people who are unfree are building this great physical monument to a nation that speaks to freedom. It's the American paradox. It is what we live through today. And it was true that there were many enslaved that worked on the Capitol while Latrobe was in charge, both before the destruction of the Capitol in 1814 and after. They were often men who were brought in from and hired out by their owners. It's important, though, to remember that they were not just manual laborers. Many of them were carpenters and skilled workers. And we should remember their contributions to our most famous of buildings, that the U.S. Capitol.
Yes. Another question about a building, very short. Please comment on the Spring House on the BMA grounds.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about it. If you visit the Baltimore Museum of Art, you don't even have to go inside, but on the western, southern grounds is what is called a dairy. Latrobe had built it for his friend Robert Harper and his estate at Oakdale, and it was later moved and recreated. To me, it is a wonderful symbol of Latrobe, a dairy, I believe, with cows and whatever, in this elegant neoclassical building with columns out front. And so I encourage you, all of you who know the Basilica, to look at another of Latrobe's extant buildings on the BMA.
And one last question from our audience. I'm trying to get through as many as we can because we don't want to leave them hanging. Did Latrobe work with any colleges or universities to develop a school of architecture?
Yes, we can talk about the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson wrote to Latrobe at one point when he was working on his academical village, as he called it. Latrobe created 2 of the pavilions, but more importantly, when Jefferson sent Latrobe his ideas, Latrobe noticed right away that there was no centering building, and that, of course, is the brick rotunda that really locates the pavilions. But besides that, Latrobe worked on Nassau Hall. He worked on a building at Dickinson College. He was responsible for a number of colleges and universities, their ideas for their campus, most notably something that all of our early founding fathers wanted, and that was a national university. Latrobe designed, it was never built, a campus which would be at the reflecting pool now. And it was really a brilliant idea. Latrobe has a high ratio of well, not all of his buildings, many of his buildings were actually built. Nonetheless, he had extensive plans for us to have a large neoclassical tradition.
Well, but I think this question also refers to, was he trying to establish a school of architecture to formalize the profession of architecture? I think you mentioned in your book that it took about 50 years for MIT to open the first school of architecture. Would that be correct?
About a school of architecture?
To formalize the profession.
Well, the first school of architecture in the United States was not really started until 1875.
Exactly.
MIT. But Latrobe really wanted to professionalize the vocation by setting up certain rules that you would have to follow. If, for example, he made a design, then you had to pay for it, even if he didn't build complete the building. And he had a whole series of ideas that he wrote.
I have a list of principles, yes. Do nothing gratuitously, work out a payment plan, design with sight in mind. never compete against friends or colleagues, and certainly not against mentors, because he was upset with some of his own students who ended up competing against him.
Try that today.
Exactly. We are at time, and it breaks my heart to end this presentation because it's so enjoyable and because I could keep talking to you for hours more, but we do need to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Jean, for sharing your time and your research with us. Thank you to all of our audience members who were here today and took the time, whether it was a lunch break, whether you took a break from work, or whether you just wanted to learn something more about building America and the man who participated in it. Thank you to everybody who donated today. This concludes our FSK series for this season. Please keep an eye out on our programming for next season. We are working very hard to bring you new content and new speakers and new fascinating topics to talk about. Thank you so much. We will see you next season.